The gunshot echoed across the plains, causing Grace Ashton to jolt against the saddle as her horse faltered beneath her. Blood bloomed across her sleeve, the wound a hot brand against her skin as she urged her exhausted mount forward through the driving rain. The outlaws couldn't be far behind, their hoofbeats masked by the storm that had turned the world into a blur of gray. Grace's vision swam, her strength fading with each passing minute as she squinted through the downpour at a distant light, a farmhouse standing alone on the harsh frontier of 1877 Wyoming Territory. Lucas Lawson stepped out onto his porch, lantern raised high against the gathering darkness, when he spotted the figure slumped over a horse approaching his homestead. The animal was stumbling, nearly spent, and the rider seemed barely conscious. He hurried down the steps, catching the reins just as the horse came to a stop, and the rider, a woman, began to slide from the saddle. "Whoa now," he said, dropping his lantern to catch her before she hit the ground. Her skin was ice-cold against his hands, and in the faint glow of the fallen lantern, her face was pale as ash, drained of all color save for the dark smudges beneath her eyes. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of stormy skies before they rolled back. Lucas lifted her into his arms, feeling the dampness of blood mixing with the rain on her sleeve. "Rest easy," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him anymore. "You're safe under my roof now." He carried her across the threshold of his modest home, kicking the door shut behind him against the howling wind. The woman in his arms was light, too light, as though she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Her chestnut hair hung in wet ropes around a face that might have been beautiful if not for the pallor of near death. Lucas laid her gently on his bed and set about lighting more lamps. By their warm glow, he assessed the damage a bullet wound to the upper arm, not immediately life-threatening but bad enough with the blood loss and exposure to the elements. He grabbed clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, and his mother's old sewing kit. "This is going to hurt, miss, but I need to get that bullet out," he told her unconscious form as he cut away the sleeve of her dress. The wound was angry and raw, the bullet lodged in the muscle. Lucas took a deep breath, steadying his hands as he had done countless times with injured livestock. He'd never dug a bullet out of a person before, but the principles couldn't be too different. He worked methodically, cleaning, extracting, and stitching, trying not to think about who this woman was or what kind of trouble had followed her to his doorstep. When he finished, he wrapped her arm in clean bandages, covered her with blankets, and settled into a chair beside the bed to keep watch through the night. It wasn't until dawn broke that Grace finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of rain clouds. She tried to sit up, panic evident in her expression before pain forced her back down. "Where am I?" she rasped, her voice dry as desert sand. Lucas leaned forward, offering her a cup of water. "My farm, about 20 miles east of Sweetwater, found you half dead on my doorstep last night." She accepted the water with a trembling hand. "Thank you, I'm Grace Lucas Lawson," he replied, studying her face in the morning light. The deathly pallor had receded somewhat, replaced by the faintest bloom of color in her cheeks. "Want to tell me why you've got a bullet in your arm and why you were riding through a storm like the devil himself was on your heels?" Grace looked away. "I'd rather not say." "Suit yourself," Lucas said, rising to his feet. "But whoever shot you might still be looking, and I'd like to know what kind of trouble I've invited into my home." Her eyes flashed with something pride, perhaps, or indignation. "I can leave as soon as I'm able." "Not saying you need to," he replied, his voice softening. "Just saying I'd appreciate knowing what I'm up against." Grace studied him for a long moment, taking in his tall, lean frame, the stubble on his jaw, the calloused hands that had extracted a bullet from her arm with surprising gentleness. There was something in his eyes, a steadfastness, a reliability that seemed rare in the world she'd been running from. "They're cattle rustlers," she finally said. "They killed my father 3 days ago when he caught them stealing our herd. I recognized one of them." "A man who works for Barrett McGrath." Lucas's expression darkened. McGrath was a wealthy rancher who'd been buying up or forcing out smaller operations across the territory. Rumors swirled about his methods, none of them honorable. "You've got evidence." "I saw them," she said firmly. "And my father kept a ledger of suspicious activities, cattle disappearing, fences cut. He was building a case." "And now they want that ledger," Lucas guessed. Grace nodded, her hand instinctively moving to the small leather pouch hidden beneath her dress. "And me dead, so I can't testify to what I saw." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, weighing his options. Harboring her was dangerous. McGrath had men throughout the territory and a long reach. But the thought of turning away this wounded woman, with her storm cloud eyes and fierce determination, didn't sit right with him. "Get some rest," he finally said. "You're safe here while you heal. We'll figure out our next move when you're stronger." Grace's eyes widened slightly. "Our next move?" "McGrath's been pushing folks around too long," Lucas said simply. "Maybe it's time someone pushed back." For the first time since she'd awakened, Grace's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied, heading toward the door. "I know what's right." Over the next few days, Grace regained her strength slowly. The bullet wound was healing clean thanks to Lucas's careful tending, though she remained weak from blood loss and the ordeal of her escape. She learned that Lucas had come west after the war between the states, staking his claim on this land 5 years ago. He ran a modest cattle operation with plans to expand once he'd saved enough. "No wife?" she asked on the third day, as he changed her bandages with those careful, gentle hands. "Never found the right woman," he answered, his eyes fixed on his work. "Or maybe never stayed in one place long enough to look properly. And now I'm settled, just me and 200 head of cattle, and Rusty." He nodded toward his cattle dog, who had taken to sleeping beside Grace's bed as though appointed her personal guardian. "It's peaceful," she observed, looking around the simple but well-kept cabin. Lucas had built it himself, adding rooms as he could afford the materials. There were touches that spoke of care: hand-carved furniture, shelves lined with books, dried wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. "Most days," he agreed, "though it gets lonely sometimes." On the 5th day, Grace insisted on getting up, despite Lucas's protests. She wore one of his shirts, the sleeves rolled up several times over her skirt. The clothing swallowed her slender frame, but she moved with determination as she helped prepare supper. "You don't have to earn your keep," Lucas told her as she sliced potatoes with her good arm. "I'm not used to sitting idle," she replied, "and I don't want to be a burden." Lucas watched her, admiring the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her hair caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. "You're not a burden." That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Grace finally told him the full story. Her father had been a respected rancher in the next county, his land coveted by McGrath for its water rights. When he refused to sell, cattle began disappearing. Fences were cut. Strange accidents befell ranch hands until most quit out of fear. "The law wouldn't help?" Lucas asked. Grace's laugh was bitter. "The sheriff is McGrath's cousin, and McGrath has half the territorial officials in his pocket. So your father started gathering evidence." She nodded, pulling the leather pouch from around her neck. From it, she extracted a small, worn journal. Names, dates, descriptions of the men involved, including the 3 who shot him and then came after me when they realized I'd seen everything. Lucas studied the meticulous notes. "This could be enough to bring him down if we can get it to the right people." "If," Grace echoed, her voice hollow. "McGrath's men will be watching every road, every town. And if they find me here, they won't," Lucas assured her, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. That night, as Grace lay awake listening to the wind howling outside, she heard Lucas moving about the cabin, checking doors and windows. The sound of his footsteps was oddly comforting, a reminder that for the first time since her father's death, she wasn't alone in her fight. On the morning of the 7th day, they spotted dust on the horizon riders approaching from the east. Lucas immediately sent Grace to the root cellar beneath the kitchen, along with Rusty for protection. "Stay quiet, no matter what happens," he instructed, pressing his revolver into her hands. "There's a tunnel that leads out to the creek bed if things go bad. Follow it west. There's a settler family about 3 miles downstream who'll help you." "Lucas," she began, but he cut her off. "I'll be fine. Just need to convince them you're not here." The root cellar door closed over her, and Grace crouched in the semi-darkness, heart pounding as she listened to Lucas greet the riders above. Their voices were muffled, but she could make out the hostile tone, the thinly veiled threats. Lucas's responses were calm, steady, offering coffee, claiming he hadn't seen any woman, suggesting they check the Weber place a few miles south. Just when it seemed they might leave, she heard a shout someone had found her horse in the barn, still bearing her saddle with her father's brand burned into the leather. Grace cocked the revolver, her injured arm aching with the movement. Through a crack in the floorboards, she could see boots moving across the kitchen floor. Lucas backed against the wall, 3 men facing him. One had a gun pressed to Lucas's chest. "Last chance, Lawson. Where's the Ashton girl? Like I said, never seen her." A fist connected with Lucas's jaw, sending him staggering. "Her horse says different. Found it wandering 2 days ago," Lucas said, spitting blood onto the floor. "Figured the owner would come looking eventually." "Search the place," the leader ordered. "Tear it apart if you have to." Grace's breath caught as she heard furniture being overturned, doors being flung open. They would find the cellar eventually. Her finger tightened on the trigger as footsteps approached the kitchen once more. Then, a new sound, hoofbeats approaching fast, followed by shouts. Grace risked peering through another crack to see a group of riders pulling up outside the cabin, a man in a marshal's badge at their lead. "What's going on here, Lawson?" the newcomer called, dismounting. "Just some visitors looking for a lost girl, Marshal Jensen," Lucas replied, his voice strained but steady. The leader of McGrath's men straightened, lowering his gun. "We're looking for a thief and murderer. This man's harboring her." "That's so?" Jensen asked, looking around at the destruction. "Seems to me like you boys are the ones causing trouble." "We're working for McGrath," the man said, as though the name itself was authority enough. Jensen smiled thinly. "McGrath doesn't run the law in this territory, much as he'd like to think so. And I've got a wire from the federal prosecutor in Cheyenne asking about the Ashton case. Seems there's some evidence that might interest them." The tension in the room was palpable as McGrath's men exchanged glances. They were outnumbered by the marshal's posse. "We'll be back," the leader said finally, pointing a finger at Lucas. "With more men." "You do that," Jensen replied, "and I'll be back with federal troops. Let's see which McGrath prefers." Grace remained hidden until the sound of retreating horses had faded completely, and Lucas himself opened the cellar door. His face was bruised, blood trickling from a split lip, but his eyes were bright with triumph. "How did the marshal know to come?" Grace asked as he helped her up. "He didn't," Lucas admitted with a wince as she touched his injured face. "That was Jake Holloway and some of the other ranchers from the valley dressed up to look official. Jake's brother was run off his land by McGrath last year." Grace stared at him, understanding dawning. "You sent for them when you saw the riders." "Had my ranch hand Billy slip out the back when we first spotted the dust. Figured we might need some friendly faces." His foresight left her momentarily speechless. Most men would have handed her over at the first sign of trouble, yet this stranger had risked everything to protect her. "Thank you isn't enough," she finally said. Lucas's eyes held hers for a long moment. "It's enough for now." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lucas outlined his plan. "Jake and the others will spread word that you headed north, toward Montana Territory. Meanwhile, I've got a friend who works for the territorial judge in Laramie. If we can get your father's journal to him, he can start building a case against McGrath quietly, so McGrath doesn't know until it's too late." Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. "Unless you'd rather go alone," Lucas replied, suddenly uncertain. She smiled, shaking her head. "No." I'm glad for the company. They set out 3 days later, traveling by night to avoid detection. Lucas had arranged for his neighbor to look after his cattle, explaining only that he had urgent business in Laramie. They rode double on Lucas's sturdy gelding, taking back trails and game paths instead of main roads. The journey was arduous, especially for Grace, whose arm still pained her despite the healing. But there was something exhilarating about the adventure, about the quiet moments around campfires when Lucas would tell stories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, or describe the places he'd seen during his wandering years after the war. Grace found herself sharing memories of her mother, who had died when she was 12, and of her father's dream to build a ranch that would someday be passed down to grandchildren. "He would have liked you," she told Lucas one night, as they huddled together beneath the stars. "He always said you could judge a man by how he treated those weaker than himself." "I'm not sure you qualify as weaker," Lucas replied with a smile. "I've seen you splint a rabbit's broken leg and face down McGrath's men without flinching. Only because you gave me the strength," she said softly. Something in his expression changed then, his eyes darkening as they dropped to her lips. For a moment, Grace thought he might kiss her, but instead he added another log to the fire and began telling her about the constellations overhead, pointing out patterns his grandfather had taught him as a boy. It was only when she drifted off to sleep beside him that she felt his hand gently brush a strand of hair from her face. They reached Laramie on the 5th day of their journey, entering the town cautiously near dusk. Lucas led them to a modest house on the outskirts where his friend, a clerk named Edward Simmons, lived. "Lucas," the man greeted them, eyes widening at the sight of Grace. "This must be the young lady you mentioned in your letter." "Grace Ashton," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "I understand you might be able to help us bring Barrett McGrath to justice." Edward ushered them inside, bolting the door behind them. "It won't be easy," he warned. "McGrath has many friends in high places. But Judge Harmon is an honest man, and he's been looking for a way to check McGrath's power for some time." Over a simple but hearty meal, they discussed strategy. The journal would need to be verified, witnesses found to corroborate Grace's account, and protection arranged for those willing to testify. "McGrath will know something's happening once we start interviewing people," Edward cautioned. "You'll both need to stay hidden until the indictment can be secured." "How long?" Lucas asked. "A month, maybe 2. Edward looked apologetic. "These things take time if we want to build a case that will stand in court." Grace felt a twinge of guilt looking at Lucas. "Your ranch will still be there," he finished for her. "This is more important." Edward arranged for them to stay in a small cabin owned by the judge, located in a secluded valley about 10 miles outside town. It was rustic but comfortable, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a small garden that had gone somewhat wild in the owner's absence. "It's not much," Edward apologized as he showed them around. "It's perfect," Grace assured him, already thinking of how they could make it livable for the coming weeks. Lucas insisted on taking the smaller room, giving Grace the slightly larger bedroom with its narrow but comfortable bed. They fell into a routine over the following days, Lucas hunting and chopping wood, Grace tending the garden and preparing meals. In the evenings, Edward would sometimes visit, bringing news from town and updates on the case. The judge had been persuaded to pursue an investigation, and federal marshals were quietly interviewing ranchers who had been pressured by McGrath. Several had come forward with their own stories, emboldened by the knowledge they weren't alone. "McGrath knows something's happening," Edward reported one evening in late September. "He sent men to search for Grace in Montana, following the false trail we laid." "And my father's ranch?" Grace asked. "Still being run by McGrath's men, but the judge has issued an order preventing its sale until your status is determined." As summer faded into autumn, Grace found herself dreading the day they would have to leave their sanctuary. She had come to cherish the peaceful evenings by the fire, watching Lucas carve small wooden animals for the shelf above the hearth. She loved the way morning light filtered through the cabin windows, how he hummed softly when he thought she wasn't listening, the gentleness in his hands when they accidentally brushed against hers. One crisp October afternoon, as they picked apples from a gnarled old tree near the cabin, Lucas caught her staring at him. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," she replied quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "I was just thinking about what happens after all this, when we go back." Lucas was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the apple in his hand. "What do you want to happen?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been so focused on survival, on justice for my father, I haven't really thought beyond that. Will you go back to your father's ranch, try to rebuild?" The question had been weighing on her mind. "I'm not sure I can do it alone, and the memories—" Lucas nodded, understanding. "You know," he said carefully, "my place isn't much, but there's good water, decent grazing land, room to expand." Grace's heart quickened. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Lawson?" His laugh was soft, nervous even. "Not exactly." He set down his basket of apples and took a step closer to her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and pine that always seemed to surround him. "I'm not good with words, Grace." "Never have been, but these past weeks—" "Yes," she encouraged when he faltered. "They've been the best of my life," he finished simply, "and I find myself not wanting them to end." Grace felt something unfurling in her chest, a warmth that had been growing steadily since that first night when he'd tended her wound with such care. "I feel the same," she whispered. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing over her skin as though she were made of porcelain. "I never expected you," he said wonderingly, "riding into my life half dead on a stormy night." "I never expected to be grateful for getting shot," she replied with a small smile. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. But as Grace's arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer, the kiss deepened into something more urgent, a confirmation of feelings that had been building between them through danger and quiet domesticity alike. "I love you," Lucas breathed against her lips when they finally parted. "I think I have since I found you on my doorstep, though I didn't know it then." Grace's laugh was bright with joy. "I think I started falling for you when you dug a bullet out of my arm without fainting." "A love story for the ages," he teased, then grew serious again. "I don't have much to offer yet, but everything I have is yours if you want it." "All I want is you," she assured him. "The rest we can build together." Their peaceful interlude was shattered 3 days later when Edward arrived in the middle of the night, his horse lathered from hard riding. McGrath had discovered their deception and learned of the investigation. His men had attacked the judge's home in Laramie, though the judge himself was safely in Cheyenne. "They're searching for you both," Edward warned. "They know you're somewhere near Laramie. It's not safe here anymore." Lucas immediately began gathering their few possessions. "Where can we go?" "There's a military outpost about 30 miles west," Edward said. "I've arranged for an escort to meet you at Miller's Crossing at dawn. They'll take you to Cheyenne, where the judge is preparing to convene a grand jury." They rode hard through the night, Edward leading them along game trails and dried creek beds to avoid the main roads where McGrath's men might be watching. As the eastern sky began to lighten, they reached Miller's Crossing, a small bridge spanning a narrow river. "The soldiers should be here soon," Edward said, dismounting to let his horse drink. "Once you're in Cheyenne, you'll be under federal protection until the trial." Grace slid from behind Lucas, stretching her stiff muscles. The past few hours had left her tense and exhausted, the brief happiness of their days at the cabin seeming like a distant dream. "What about you?" Lucas asked Edward. "Won't McGrath suspect you helped us?" Edward nodded grimly. "I've sent my wife to stay with her sister in Denver. I'll join her once you're safely delivered." A sound in the distance made them all freeze, horses approaching fast from the direction they had come. "They've followed our trail," Lucas realized, grabbing the rifle from his saddle. "Edward, take Grace and go. I'll hold them off until the soldiers arrive." "No," Grace protested, clutching his arm. "We stay together." "There's no time to argue," Lucas insisted, his eyes pleading. "Please, Grace, I can't lose you." Edward was already mounting up. "He's right, the soldiers will be here any minute." Lucas just needs to delay McGrath's men. Torn between fear for Lucas and the knowledge that he was right, Grace made a split-second decision. She pulled him into a fierce kiss. "Don't you dare die," she ordered. "Not when we've just found each other." "I don't intend to," he promised. "Now go." Grace allowed Edward to help her onto his horse, her eyes locked with Lucas's until the bend in the river took him from sight. They rode hard for nearly 10 minutes before the sound of gunfire echoed behind them. "We have to go back," Grace cried, trying to turn the horse. "That could be the soldiers arriving," Edward said, though he looked uncertain. "We need to keep moving." Before Grace could argue further, riders appeared ahead of them, but they weren't the promised military escort. The sun glinted off a familiar silver belt buckle as Barrett McGrath himself reined his horse to a stop before them, flanked by 4 armed men. "Miss Ashton," McGrath greeted her, his smile cold beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. "How kind of you to deliver yourself and that troublesome journal directly to me." Edward reached for his pistol but never cleared the holster. A shot rang out and he slumped forward, blood blossoming on his shirt. The horse reared in panic, throwing both riders to the ground. Grace scrambled to Edward's side, pressing her hands to his wound as he gasped for breath. "The journal," McGrath demanded, dismounting and approaching her with outstretched hand. "Now." "It's not here," Grace said defiantly, rising to stand between McGrath and Edward's prone form. "It's already with the federal prosecutor in Cheyenne." McGrath's face darkened with rage. "You're lying." "Am I? Why do you think we were heading to Miller's Crossing? To meet the military escort that will testify I handed over all evidence yesterday." Uncertainty flickered in McGrath's eyes. "Search them," he ordered his men. Rough hands pulled Grace away from Edward, patting her down while another man searched through Edward's saddlebags. "Nothing, boss," one reported. "No journal." McGrath grabbed Grace by the arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "Where is it?" More gunfire sounded from the direction of the crossing, closer now. McGrath's head snapped up, listening. "Bring them," he ordered. "We need to get out of here." As his men moved to comply, hoofbeats thundered around the bend. Grace's heart leapt at the sight of blue uniforms. The promised military escort had finally arrived, with Lucas riding alongside them, his face bloody but his eyes burning with determination as they fell on McGrath's hand gripping Grace's arm. What followed was chaos. McGrath's men opened fire. Soldiers returned it, and Grace found herself diving for cover behind a fallen log as bullets splintered bark around her. Through the smoke and confusion, she saw Lucas dismount and charge toward her, heedless of the danger. He was halfway to her when McGrath emerged from behind a boulder, revolver aimed squarely at Lucas's back. Without thinking, Grace launched herself forward, tackling McGrath just as he fired. The bullet went wide and they both tumbled to the ground, wrestling for control of the weapon. McGrath was stronger, but Grace was fighting for more than her life now. She was fighting for a future she'd only just allowed herself to imagine. Her fingers closed around a rock, and she brought it down hard against McGrath's temple. He slumped, momentarily stunned, and Grace wrenched the gun from his grasp. Lucas reached them then, hauling McGrath up and delivering a punch that sent the rancher sprawling. Soldiers converged, taking McGrath into custody as the last of his men surrendered or fled. "Edward?" Grace asked, looking around frantically. "A soldier's tending to him," Lucas assured her, pulling her into his arms. "He's alive, though it's a bad wound." Grace sagged against him, the adrenaline of the past hour giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. "I thought I'd lost you when I heard the gunfire." "Takes more than a few hired guns to separate me from the woman I love," Lucas said, pressing his forehead to hers. "Though I admit, watching you tackle a man twice your size was both terrifying and impressive." She laughed weakly. "I couldn't let him shoot you." "Not when we have so many plans to make." In the aftermath, Edward was transported to the military outpost where a surgeon was able to remove the bullet and stabilize him. McGrath and his captured men were taken to Cheyenne in chains to await trial, while Grace and Lucas gave their statements to both military and civil authorities. The journal, which Lucas had kept hidden in a secret compartment of his saddle, was finally delivered into the hands of the federal prosecutor. Combined with testimony from other ranchers and Edward's official accounts, it formed the backbone of a case that would eventually send Barrett McGrath to prison for murder, attempted murder, theft, corruption, and a dozen other crimes. Grace and Lucas remained in Cheyenne under protection until the grand jury delivered its indictments 2 weeks later. By then, Edward was well enough to travel to Denver, with assurances that his position with the court would be waiting when he returned. "What will you do now?" he asked them the night before his departure. "Return to your ranch, Lucas." Lucas looked at Grace, his hand finding hers. "Eventually, but first, I believe I owe this lady a proper courtship without bullets and desperate flights through the wilderness." "I don't know," Grace teased. "I've grown rather accustomed to the excitement." In truth, they had spoken at length about their future during the quiet evenings in Cheyenne. Grace's father's ranch would be returned to her once the legal proceedings were complete, but the memories there were still too painful. Lucas had suggested selling it and using the proceeds to expand his own operation, building something new together. "I think your father would approve," he'd told her as they walked along the streets of Cheyenne one crisp autumn evening. "Not of me, necessarily. I'm sure he had someone far more impressive in mind for his daughter, but of you making a fresh start, building something that's truly yours." "Ours," she'd corrected him, "and he would have approved of you. He valued honesty and courage above all things." They were married in a small ceremony in Laramie 2 months later, with Edward standing as Lucas's best man and the judge himself officiating. Grace wore a simple ivory dress that set off the healthy glow that had replaced the deathly pallor of their first meeting. "You're a far cry from the woman I found half dead on my doorstep," Lucas whispered as they danced at their modest reception. "Though I thought you beautiful even then. Even with my face as pale as ash," she asked with a smile. "Especially then," he assured her. "It brought out the color of your eyes." They returned to Lucas's ranch, their ranch now in time for the first snow of winter. The cabin seemed to welcome them home, smoke curling from the chimney as they approached in the wagon laden with supplies for the coming months. Lucas lifted Grace down from the seat, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her toward the door. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "The threshold tradition is for new houses." "This is a new house," he said, pushing the door open with his foot, "because you're in it now." Inside, Grace found the cabin transformed. Lucas had arranged for neighbors to make improvements during their absence. New curtains hung at the windows, the floors had been polished, and a rocking chair sat beside the hearth. On the table was a small wooden carving of a horse that resembled the one she'd ridden to his door that stormy night. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," he said, finally setting her down. Grace turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "It's perfect." That night, as they lay before the fire, Grace traced the scar on Lucas's shoulder where a bullet had grazed him during the standoff at Miller's Crossing. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking in a half-dead stranger who brought nothing but trouble to your door?" Lucas caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Not for a single moment," he said with absolute certainty. "You brought me far more than trouble, Grace. You brought me purpose, a future, love. Even though we almost died several times over," she teased. "Makes for a better story to tell our grandchildren someday," he replied with a grin. As winter deepened, they settled into the rhythms of ranch life. Grace proved to be a natural with the cattle, her experience on her father's ranch serving her well. Lucas expanded their operation, purchasing neighboring land that had been part of McGrath's holdings when they were auctioned by the Territory. News reached them in early spring that McGrath had been sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Several of his men had received lesser sentences, while others had turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. Justice was served, Lucas observed as they read the newspaper account, though nothing can bring your father back. No, Grace agreed, her hand resting on her slightly rounded stomach. But his memory will live on, and so will his name. Lucas's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. A boy, perhaps, she smiled, or a girl who will carry on the Ashton legacy in her own way. Their daughter, Lillian Catherine Lawson, was born the following autumn, with her mother's storm-cloud eyes and her father's determined chin. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, George Thomas, named for Grace's father. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the territory. They built a larger house as their family grew, though they kept the original cabin standing a reminder of where their story had begun. On the 10th anniversary of the night Grace had ridden into Lucas's life, they sat on the porch of that first cabin, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Sometimes I still can't believe how lucky I am," Lucas said, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "That of all the places you could have sought refuge that night, you chose my doorstep." "It wasn't luck," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "It was Providence." Lucas smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Do you remember what I said to you that night? Rest easy," Grace quoted softly. "You're safe under my roof now." "I meant it then," he said, "and I mean it still." As darkness fell completely over the Wyoming plains, they remained together on the porch, surrounded by the life they had built from the most unlikely of beginnings, a wounded woman with a face as pale as ash, and the cowboy who had promised her safety and delivered so much more.